long before memory learned how to speak in names, before stories learned how to hold their shape. There was a sense that the world had once been quieter, in a different way, not silent, but spacious. As if the air itself remembered being listened to. The nights then were not empty. They carried weight, and the weight carried meaning, though no one could say where it came from. Even now, when sleep loosens the careful knots of waking thought, that sense sometimes returns, a feeling that something once stood nearby and then chose not to remain in those distant ages. Time did not move, as it does now. It did not hurry. It did not measure itself against endings. Days passed like breath, and breath passed like water over stone. What people knew was not separated from how they lived. Knowledge did not feel owned or discovered. It felt received, as if it had always been there, and was only waiting to be noticed. Tools were shaped slowly, words were spoken softly, and the world seemed to answer not with commands, but with permission. Some memories suggest that humanity was not always alone in learning how to see itself. Not guided in the way a teacher stands above a student, but accompanied as one might walk beside another through unfamiliar land. These presences, later remembered as the Anunnaki, not described clearly in the oldest whispers. They are felt more than seen. Their forms change from telling to telling, and sometimes vanish altogether, leaving only the impression that something attentive once shared the horizon. It may be that they were never meant to be understood as beings who arrived. Perhaps they were remembered as something closer to a pause in the world, a moment when understanding deepened without force. They did not build empires in these memories. They did not rule. They did not demand. Instead, they appear like shadows at the edge of awareness, present just long enough for something within humanity to awaken, then gone before dependence could take root. As generations passed, those early moments softened. Memory, like clay left in the sun, began to crack. Stories filled the gaps. Names were given. What had once been an atmosphere became a pantheon. Yet even in these later retellings, there is a recurring restraint. The Anunnaki do not linger. They withdraw. They step back. Again and again, the stories end, not with triumph, but with absence. It may be that staying would have changed humanity in ways that could not be undone. To remain too close, too present, might have stilled the slow growth of human becoming. Knowledge, when held too tightly by another, can turn heavy. It can replace curiosity with obedience. Perhaps it was seen that humanity needed uncertainty in order to remain human. And so, instead of remaining as voices or rulers, knowledge itself was left behind. Not written as instruction, not carved as law, but scattered gently into the fabric of memory, patterns, rinns, the understanding that water remembers paths, that stone holds time, that silence can teach. If one is willing to listen, these were not lessons delivered. They were impressions placed quietly, like seeds pressed into soil without marking the ground. Over time, people forgot where the seeds came from. They only knew that something within them reached upward, toward meaning, toward order, toward connection with what could not be fully named. In this telling, the Anunnaki did not leave monuments. They left gaps, and those gaps invited thought. They invited myth. They invited the long human habit of wondering why something feels familiar even when it cannot be recalled. Perhaps that is why their memory feels less like history and more like inheritance. Something passed down, not through certainty but through longing. As humanity changed, so did the stories. Agriculture rooted people to land. Settlements rose. Words hardened into symbols. With permanence came hierarchy. In these later ages, the Anunnaki were reshaped to fit new needs. They became architects, judges, creators. But beneath these louder versions, the older tone remains, almost inaudible. Do you sense that they stepped away, not out of failure, but out of restraint? It may be that their departure was remembered as a kindness to leave knowledge without control, to allow humans to make mistakes, to forget, to reach imperfect, to let wisdom fracture into culture, ritual, and myth, rather than remain whole and overwhelming. In doing so, humanity was not preserved in perfection, but released into possibility, sometimes in the quiet between thoughts. What if guidance that remains too visible prevents growth? What if the greatest gift was not presence, but distance? In this light, absence becomes an act of care, silence becomes a form of teaching. The flood stories that later emerged may echo this same memory, though distorted by fear, not necessarily a destruction of the world, but a washing away of closeness, a boundary drawn between what once felt near and what must now be remembered. Water, in these stories, does not only erase, separates before and after, presence and memory. After the waters recede, humanity stands alone, but not empty. Something remains. A sense of responsibility, the awareness that knowledge carries weight, and that using it without humility leads to imbalance. These are not commands from gods, they are echoes of something once observed, once shared, then deliberately withheld. Perhaps that is why the Anunnaki are so often described as watching, as figures who recede into the background of the world's unfolding. Their role, if remembered correctly, was never to stay. As centuries turned into ages, and ages into forgotten epochs, humanity learned to speak of progress and decline. Yet beneath these cycles, the quieter inheritance continued, to feel the weight of choices, even when no one is watching. These qualities did not need guardians, they needed space. And so the memory settles into a strange stillness. Not a story of gods departing in anger, nor of humans abandoned to chaos, but of a careful withdrawal, a decision made in silence, knowledge left behind, not as power, but as responsibility. If one listens closely, especially in the half-light between waking and sleep, this memory does not ask to be believed. It does not demand agreement. It only invites contemplation. That perhaps what shaped humanity most was not what stayed close, but what trusted us enough to step away. And in that stepping away, something essential was preserved, not the certainty of answers, but the fragile, enduring ability to seek them. That seeking did not move in straight lines. It wandered. It circled back on itself. It forgot what it once touched, and then rediscovered fragments, in altered forms. In this way, the knowledge that had been left behind did not remain pure. It could not. It mixed with fear, with hope, with hunger, with love. It became human, and perhaps that was always the intention. As villages grew into cities, and cities learned how to remember themselves through walls and tablets, shapes pressed into clay, stories spoken at dusk, songs murmured while grinding grain. None of these carried the whole memory. Each held only a portion, softened by time and shaped by need. Yet something consistent lingered beneath them all, the sense that wisdom was never meant to dominate, only to accompany. In the earliest retellings, the Anunnaki do not argue among themselves. They do not struggle for supremacy. Conflict enters later, when human societies begin to mirror their own hierarchies onto the remembered past. The quieter versions describe them as distant, coordinated, almost careful, as if they understood something fragile about the human condition, long before humans did themselves. Perhaps they saw that imitation comes easily, but understanding does not. If humanity had remained under the constant presence of something greater, it might have learned obedience more quickly than discernment. It might have copied form without grasping meaning. In this telling, withdrawal was not a loss of interest, but a refusal to be mirrored. The knowledge that remained was therefore incomplete by design. It arrived without instructions, without guarantees. Humans were left to decide how to use what they sensed, to build, to destroy, to forget, to remember again. Each choice altered the inheritance slightly, like a word passed through many mouths. This may explain why ancient traditions often speak of a time when communication between worlds felt closer, and why that closeness always fades. The fading itself becomes sacred. Distance acquires meaning. What is no longer accessible becomes worthy of ritual, of longing, of careful remembrance. Silence gains depth. Laws are framed not as inventions, but as restorations, as if they are attempts to recall something that once felt known. Yet no law ever fully satisfies. There is always tension between rule and intuition, between structure and conscience. Perhaps this tension is the echo of knowledge given without control. In some memories, The Anunnaki are said to have warned of imbalance, though the warning is never clear, not a prophecy, but a sensitivity, an awareness that too much interference would tip something delicate. Humanity was not meant to be protected from consequence forever. Learning requires exposure. Growth requires risk. There is no single moment of departure, no final farewell, just increasing distance, longer silences, fewer impressions, until what remains is no longer presence, but recollection, and even recollection begins to fray. What humans do with this absence becomes their defining task. Some fill it with certainty, constructing rigid explanations. Others sit with the uncertainty, allowing meaning to remain fluid. Both responses grow from the same source, a knowledge that was left unfinished. It may be that the myths of creation themselves are shaped by this incompleteness. Humanity remembers being shaped, but not fully explained, being guided, but not commanded. The result is a species endlessly narrating its own beginnings, never fully satisfied with any single version. At night, when the world grows quieter and thought loosens its grip, this unresolved beginning can feel close again, the sense that something once stood just beyond reach, attentive but restrained, that what was given mattered less than what was withheld. Perhaps this is why the Anunnaki are so often associated with thresholds rather than destinations, with beginnings rather than endings, with moments of transition rather than periods of stability. They appear where something is about to change and disappear before the change settles. In this way, they are remembered not as owners of knowledge, but as its carriers, briefly present, then gone, like wind passing over water, leaving patterns that persist long after the air has moved on. The world that followed their fading was noisier. Human voices multiplied, stories competed. And 40, the sense that knowledge carries responsibility, that power without restraint leads to collapse, that silence can sometimes teach more than instruction. Flood stories, collapses, fragments, these may all be ways of circling. The same intuition that humanity has always stood near thresholds. It barely understands that something once stepped back to allow those thresholds to barely understands. If the Anunnaki had remained, perhaps humanity would have stabilized too soon, found answers too quickly, lost the slow aching process of becoming. In leaving, they preserve not certainty but depth, and so the memory persists, not as doctrine, but as atmosphere, as a feeling that returns in moments of stillness, that something important was trusted to us, that we were left not because we were unworthy of guidance, but because we were capable of growth. This idea does not comfort everyone. For some, absence feels like loss, silence feels like abandonment. Yet for others, it carries a gentler meaning, that freedom was chosen over control. As sleep draws nearer, this thought softens. The sharp edges of history blur. What remains is not a question demanding answer, but a presence felt through its absence. A reminder that what shaped us most may not be what stayed, but what stepped away quietly, leaving us to listen to the echoes. And those echoes still move through us now, carried in myth, in memory, in the long human habit of wondering where knowledge comes from, and why it was never meant to stay whole. That wondering, once awakened, never truly settles. It passes from one generation to the next like a low, steady hum beneath daily life. Children sense it before they learn its names. Elders feel it after words begin to thin. It does not announce itself loudly, it waits for quiet moments. When the world loosens its hold and memory drifts closer to feeling than fact, in the earliest communal nights when firelight flickered against stone and shadow, they were told to hold space for what could not be resolved. The Anunnaki, in these soft retellings, are never fully described. Their faces blur, their voices are indirect. Sometimes they are present only through what they do not say. The storyteller pauses, lowers their voice, and allows silence to complete the thought. This silence may be the most faithful inheritance of all. Not the names, not the imagined forms, but the restraint, the refusal to fill every gap. the understanding that some knowledge loses its meaning when spoken too clearly. Perhaps this, too, was left behind. Deliberately, as human society became more cumbrous, memory hardened into narrative, and narrative into structure. The Anunnaki, once remembered as distant companions, were reshaped into figures of authority. Their withdrawal was reinterpreted as judgment, conflict, or exile. Yet even these altered stories betray an unease. Something does not align. The departure never feels violent enough to justify the drama later assigned to it. Beneath the embellished versions, the quieter truth continues to pulse. That leaving was not punishment. That silence was not rejection. That absence was not the result of failure, but of choice. It may be that the Anunnaki were remembered as understanding something essential of behavior, but identity. To remain too visible is to risk becoming the measure by which all things are judged. In stepping away, they allowed humanity to become its own reference point. This does not mean humanity was left without guidance. Rather, guidance was transformed into something internal. Intuition replaced instruction. The ability to sense imbalance became more important than obedience to rule. Such qualities are fragile. They require cultivation. They can be ignored. They can be corrupted, but they cannot be enforced was accepted. Perhaps it was even preferred. As centuries unfolded, people began to speak of ages, golden times followed by decline. Yet even these divisions carry an implicit acknowledgement that something precious cannot be sustained indefinitely. That closeness fades, that clarity dims, that what is gained through immediacy is lost through permanence. In the quieter memory, the Anunnaki do not promise eternal guidance. They do not offer protection from consequence. Instead, they seem to trust that humanity must learn through its own motion, its own errors, its own interpretations of the traces left behind. Sometimes, this trust feels heavy. The weight of responsibility presses inward. Especially in moments when human choices lead to suffering, it is tempting then to imagine that staying would have prevented such outcomes. That closer supervision might have corrected mistakes before they spread. Yet this thought carries its own unease. For correction without consent becomes control, and control, even when well-intended, reshapes what it governs. In this light, the withdrawal becomes not an absence of care, but an expression of it. The old flood memories may reflect this tension. Boundaries dissolve. What was structured is undone, and afterward humanity begins again, altered but still free. The waters do not erase knowledge entirely. They thin it, they scatter it. They ensure that nothing remains too fixed. Perhaps this scattering was already underway, long before the floods were imagined. It was meant to disperse, to mingle with culture, with language, with landscape, to become many things rather than one truth. In this dispersal, humanity learned how to remember differently, not by preserving exact meanings, but by recreating significance through ritual. In story, each retelling became an act of interpretation. This is why the Anunnaki feel both familiar and unreachable. They occupy the space between recognition and uncertainty. They are close enough to feel meaningful, distant enough to resist definition. They are remembered not as answers, but as prompts when night deepens and the mind drifts. This prompt becomes gentle. It does not ask to be solved. A listening posture, the sense that understanding unfolds slowly, if at all, and that this slowness is not a flaw. Perhaps the most enduring gift left behind was not knowledge itself, but patience. The ability to sit with incomplete understanding, to allow meaning to arrive gradually, shaped by experience. In many traditions, wisdom is associated with elders, with those who have learned when not to speak. This mirrors the remembered behavior of the Anunnaki. Their silence becomes exemplary. As humanity aged, it learned to fill silence with sound. Cities grew louder. Certainty became currency. Yet silence never vanished entirely. It waited in the margins, in deserts, in mountains, in the pause before sleep. It is there, in these margins, that the old memory breathes most clearly. The sense that something once stepped aside so that humanity could step forward, not confidently, not perfectly, but authentically. This falters. It returns to old questions in new forms. Yet beneath the repetition lies a continuity, the inheritance of responsibility, the quiet understanding that knowledge shapes the world and that how it is held matters as much as what it contains. If the Anunnaki are remembered at all, perhaps it is because their absence made room for this understanding to grow. Their departure carved a hollow that humanity filled not with obedience, but with interpretation. And interpretation, though messy, is alive. It allows meaning to evolve. It allows mistakes to teach. It allows wisdom to remain dynamic rather than fixed. As the night stretches on and thought softens further, the story does not seek closure. Just as the knowledge left behind was never whole, the memory of those who left remains unfinished. In this unfinished space, humanity continues to listen, not for voices returning, but for the subtle guidance already within reach. And perhaps that is where the truest inheritance has always rested. That inner guidance is not loud. It does not rise above the noise of the world, unless the world itself grows quiet. Most of the time, it remains beneath habit and routine, beneath language and certainty. Yet it persists, steady and patient, waiting for moments when attention loosens and listening becomes possible again. In those moments, the idea of being left behind softens into something else. It begins to resemble being trusted to choose, to err, to repair, trusted to carry fragments without demanding completion. The memory of the Anunnaki, when held this way, is not heavy. It does not press for belief. It rests lightly, like a thought that does not need to be finished. Perhaps this is why their stories endure, even when their details dissolve. They are not preserved because they explain the world, but because they gesture toward a posture within it, a way of standing in relation to knowledge that is neither grasping nor dismissive. Attentive, but not dependent, as human history unfolded, periods of confidence. Each time certainty hardened too much, something fractured. Swing fell, languishes faded, cities returned to dust. Yet after each collapse, humanity rebuilt. Not exactly what had been lost, but something altered, something informed by memory, even when memory was incomplete. That nothing meant to remain alive can be fully stabilized. That movement, loss, and reinterpretation are not failures, but conditions of endurance. In the quieter traditions, wisdom is not portrayed as accumulation. It is depicted as balance, as knowing when to step forward and when to step back, when to speak and when to remain silent. These are not skills easily taught. They must be felt, practiced, lived. If the Anunnaki were remembered as silent teachers, it may be because their most enduring lesson was not delivered through words. It was demonstrated through absence, through restraint, through the deliberate choice not to occupy the center of human becoming. This choice, if remembered imperfectly, has nonetheless shaped the contours of myth and meaning. Even the idea of sacredness carries this trace. The sacred is often that which cannot be fully accessed. It resists ownership. It demands humility. In this sense, the Anunnaki did not disappear. They receded into pattern, into the structure of how humans relate to what they cannot control, into the instinctive respect for thresholds between knowing and not knowing, presence and absence, power and responsibility. As the night deepens further and the mind drifts closer to rest, these patterns feel less abstract. That understanding is not something to be seized. That meaning does not require completion. That some truths remain gentle precisely because they remain partial. Perhaps humanity was never meant to inherit certainty. Perhaps it was meant to inherit the capacity to listen, to interpret, to adapt. If so, then the departure remembered in these ancient whispers was not an ending. It was a beginning of a different kind, one that unfolds, slowly, unevenly across generations, one that cannot be finished, only continued. And so the story does not close, it loosens. It allows itself to fade at the edges, just as the memory of those who stepped away has always faded. What remains is not a figure, not a command, not a doctrine, but a quiet space where thought can rest. In that space, the listener is not asked to believe, only to notice the rhythm of breath, the softness of silence, the subtle feeling that some knowledge was left not to be held, but to be lived. And as sleep approaches, this feeling requires nothing further. It asks no answer. It leaves no demand. Like those remembered presences, it steps back gently, trusting that what matters will continue, unfinished, imperfect, and quietly alive. In that quiet aliveness, the world seems to breathe differently. The sharp outlines of purpose soften, and the urge to define loosens its grip. What remains is a sense of continuity, not bound to achievement or explanation, but to presence itself. It is here, in this gentler awareness, that the memory of what was left behind feels closest, not as information, but as orientation. Long ago, before the idea of knowledge became something to possess, it may have been experienced as relationship, a way of standing within the world rather than above it. The Anunnaki, as remembered in this softer tradition, did not separate knowing from being. They did not extract understanding from its surroundings. They moved within it, attentive to balance, aware that to disturb too much was to distort. Perhaps this is why their remembered actions feel so restrained. They do not transform the world through force. They do not impose shape upon it. Instead, they seem to adjust themselves, stepping back when their presence risks becoming too influential. Their power, if it existed at all in these memories, lay not in intervention, but in discernment, struggled to interpret it. Over time, fragments became symbols, and symbols hardened into authority. Yet even as institutions formed and traditions codified, something essential remained elusive. The feeling that wisdom resists enclosure, that it withdraws when claimed too confidently. This elusiveness has often been mistaken for loss, but it may be closer to an invitation, an ongoing call to humility, to understanding that unfolds through attentiveness rather than domination. In the long span of memory, humanity's greatest creations often arise, not from certainty, but from tension, between what is known and what is sensed, between what is remembered and what is forgotten. This tension keeps thought alive. It prevents meaning from settling into finality. If the Anunnaki were remembered as leaving knowledge behind, it may be because knowledge itself was never meant to be finished. It was meant to remain responsive, to shift as humanity shifted, to deepen as experience accumulated. In this way, absence becomes a condition for growth. The stories that speak of divine withdrawal may therefore reflect an early recognition of this truth. That guidance which never recedes becomes constraint. That answers which never fade become obstacles. In stepping away, the remembered figures preserved the pottery of learning. As centuries layered upon centuries, humanity learned to end of learning. This brought comfort, but also dependency. And when that external authority seemed silent or distant, fear filled the space. Myths grew louder, explanations grew more rigid. Yet beneath this noise, a quieter current persisted. The sense that understanding must be internalized to remain meaningful, that what truly guides cannot be handed down fully formed. It must be discovered, again and again, through lived experience. This discovery is slow. It resists efficiency. It often unfolds through error. Perhaps this too was anticipated, that humanity would stumble, that it would misuse power with wisdom. Yet even these missteps contribute to the long process of becoming. In the memory of the Anunnaki's withdrawal, there is no judgment attached, no condemnation, only a recognition of timing, of knowing when to leave before influence turns into interference, of understanding that presence carries consequences, even when intentions are gentle. Such tires a view beyond immediate outcomes. Perhaps this is why these figures are remembered as distant. Their perspective feels wider, slower, less entangled in urgency. They do not rush to correct. They allow unfolding human time, by contrast, accelerates. It seeks resolution. It demands clarity. This difference in rhythm may explain the eventual separation. To remain would have required slowing humanity down, anchoring it to an external pace. To leave allowed human time to find its own uneven cadence. In this unevenness, culture emerges. Art, ritual, story, These are not efficient carriers of knowledge. They distort, they embellish, they forget, yet they also preserve. They allow meaning to survive beyond precision. The Anunnaki remembered through these forms become less like figures and more like atmospheres. A mood of restraint, a memory of gentleness, a suggestion that not all influence should be exercised. When night deepens further and the boundary between thought and feeling softens, the need to categorize fades, the desire to conclude dissolves. What remains is a subtle awareness that some things are most truthful when left unresolved. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding was the belief that departure equals disappearance. In these quieter memories, what steps away does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes less visible, but more pervasive. It moves from presence into pattern. Patterns endure longer than figures. They shape behavior without demanding recognition. They guide without instruction. If this was the legacy left behind at Blakely, it must be felt. Humanity, living within these patterns, often resists acknowledging them. They remind, they constrain, yet they also support. They create coherence across time. The pattern left by withdrawal may be one of self-restraint, of learning when not to act, of recognizing that influence carries responsibility. These lessons are difficult. They do not flatter. They do not promise control. And yet, when embraced, they foster quarter, one that does not require constant affirmation, one that allows space for others to grow. Perhaps this is the strength remembered, faintly in the Anunnaki's absence, as sleep approaches more fully. The narrative loosens its hold. It no longer seeks to persuade or explain. It settles into resonance, a feeling that some guidance was given not to direct humanity's path, but to ensure that the path remained open to change, open to reinterpretation, open to silence. In this openness, the memory rests. It does not demand revived concrete. Like the figures who withdrew, it remains at a respectful distance, trusting that what was left behind will continue to unfold in its own time. And so the listening continues quietly within each passing generation, as long as there are moments of stillness in which to hear what was never meant to speak aloud. That quiet listening does not belong to any single era. It is not confined to the distant past, nor does it wait for a future resolution. It exists now, whenever attention softens, and the need to arrive somewhere loosens. In these moments, the memory of what was left behind feels less like history and more like atmosphere, for something breathed rather than recalled. Perhaps this is why the idea endures without requiring belief. It does not ask to be proven or defended. It simply lingers, offering a different way of relating to what is unknown, not as a problem to solve, but as a presence to sit with. The Anunnaki, remembered through this lens, are not figures standing behind humanity, nor ahead of it. They are remembered as having stepped aside, allowing the human story to move without a fixed destination. In this steppity of becoming, not becoming perfect or complete, but becoming responsive, capable of reflection, able to sense when action is needed, and when restraint carries greater wisdom. The knowledge left behind was never meant to shine brightly or demand attention. It was meant to blend into life itself, into how they recognize espace, into the quiet discomfort that arises when something feels out of alignment. Even if no rule has been broken, this discomfort is subtle. It does not shout, it waits. And waiting, in a world that values speed, often goes unnoticed. Yet it is here that the oldest inheritance may still speak, without words, without instruction. If the Anunnaki were remembered as leaving because staying would end humanity, it may be because humanity needed uncertainty in order to remain alive to itself, needed distance in order to develop inner measure, needed silence so that its own voice could form uneven and phrasing though it might be in this telling. Nothing was taken away. What was removed was closeness, not care. What was withdrawn was presence, not concern. The world was left open, unfinished, capable of change. And perhaps this unfinished quality is the truest marker of trust. As sleep settles more deeply, the The story does not conclude with an answer. It fades instead, leaving behind a sense rather than a statement. A sense that some guidance was given not to shape the world directly, but to ensure that it could continue shaping itself. That humanity was allowed to wander, to err, to remember imperfectly, because perfection would have narrowed what it could become. In this way, the departure remembered so faintly was not an ending at all. It was a widening, a clearing of space, an opening in which human experience could unfold without constant supervision. The night holds this idea easily. It does not press for resolution. It allows thought to slow, to soften, to rest. And as the listener drifts further into stillness, nothing more is required. The memory steps back once more, quiet and unobtrusive, trusting that what was left behind continues, not loudly, not clearly, but patiently, within the long unfinished story of being human.